So hello and welcome to everyone listening. It's a real pleasure today to be in conversation with Stanley Schtinter. Of course, a name and an artist who will be familiar to you, no doubt, on whatever platform you're encountering this conversation. Because his work, well beyond the particular project that we're going to be talking about today, one of his finest to date, but his reputation, as I said, travels well beyond just this project and is of particular note in the culture, I would say, at the moment, because it ignores all boundaries, definitions, constrictions, molds, and templates that are normally placed around any artwork, artifact, or encounter with culture, really, in the present tense that we find ourselves. Willfully ignores those boundaries, borders, and territorial delineations to bring us a range of cultural projects that we haven't really seen the likes of since the heydays of the counterculture. Now, whichever counterculture you might choose to align yourself with, I still hold my ground on the claim that I've just made, because these are works that both engage socially and politically, but never rhetorically, with the craven, dissolute, decadent, and frankly appalling culture in the wider sense of that word that we find ourselves in, while proposing in that resistance and refusal a wholly utopian and visionary way of being in the world that predominates with a sense of chance, of creative possibility, of collaborative encounter, and frankly raises the stakes on what cultural production is at the very moment that we find ourselves encountering it, but also historically makes us think that we've actually been misdefining pretty much everything that we think of as culturally valuable in the last 20 or so, 30 years even. Because what passed as an artifact of note is now seen in the light of Schtinter's practice to actually be very much anything but that, if we take culture to be something of necessity, even urgency, to the fact of being human. So with that proposal in mind, welcome, Stanley. It's a great pleasure to be in conversation.
Well, it's a very generous proposal, Gareth. I'm grateful for your conversation.
So we're talking today about the last movies rather, because the suggests a kind of definitive statement on your subject matter, which of course, as I've said in my introduction, we wouldn't expect you to make such a claim for. Rather, last movies. Now, this is an incredible project, which I hope obviously we're going to explore in its widest possible ramifications now. But can you just take us back? It's quite a long-term project for you now, and it manifests, of course, as a book work, as a multi-screen programming event working internationally. But most relevantly, perhaps, to the introduction I just gave, it's a radical proposal to think afresh both about art, particularly cinema in this case, and how culture engages with life. Now, you don't have to accept any of these proposals that I'm making, but could you take us back to when the kind of the light bulb went on as to how and why last movies could work as an engagement with cinema and life?
It was discovering that the Swedish Prime Minister in 1986, Olof Palme, was assassinated leaving the cinema. There's been a huge amount of interest and speculation over the years in this still unsolved murder case, but my question was, what did he see? And that was a film called The Mozart Brothers by Susan Austen, a kind of inversion of Don Giovanni. This set in motion a peculiarly indirect research project. I wanted to know if I could potentially remap the first century of cinema from the film form's inception to the present day, according to the final viewing experiences of notable public figures. They have to be public figures because I'm drawing on their story as well as the films. And by notable, I mean that their last days and hours have been given significant enough scrutiny and detail that we know what they watched if they did watch a film. Otherwise, it's a case of someone who has watched a film with such close proximity to death that it becomes a part of their life story. So that would be the case with Olof Palme.
Thank you very much. Now, of course, the seeing of a film before death could happen at any time, both extremely local to to the passing from this world, or obviously, in the days, weeks, even months before. Now, one of the subjects that you look at, of course, is Anne Frank, and then she saw, the last film that she saw, significantly in advance of her tragic death, while others, of course, saw it and then actually followed through in several cases with their own realization of that terminal moment. So how did you then, once you'd got this very rich idea, which will come onto the kind of the metaphysical and philosophical implications of very shortly, once you constructed this idea, how then did you begin to, first of all, range across time, place, culture, history, political figures, public figures of all kinds? And then, secondly, once you had kind of, started to assemble a list, how did you think about its ordering and relationship? Now, these are long answers potentially, right? Because I think that this is the kind of core, if you like, of the project. And I'd be very, very interested to hear about the systemic arrangement of things once you have encountered this like huge terrain of chance, which, of course, as Erica Balsam says in her essay in the book, is in a way the new and radical ordering of cinema that you're proposing.
The approach is somehow both intervention and a refusal to intervene, and so it was important to me, and logical too, to arrange the viewers and their films in chronological order. That is to say, according to the date of death rather than the date of the film's making. I initially conceived of this whole project as some kind of durational artwork. I conceived of it as a logical extension of sampling culture in taking the whole work and transforming its context through the absence of control rather than the assertion or occupation of. A frequent misunderstanding of last movies has been the description of it as conspiratorial, but just because we can't make immediate sense of the connections and collisions that the project uncovers or studies, it doesn't make them any less real, any less there. I think that the audience is broadly insulted, be it by streaming platforms or by going to the cinema, at least in the UK. And so this project must be some kind of a response to a deep wish for the audience to be honoured and respected in this time of totalitarian delegation and de-imagination. It's also important to state that I didn't select the figures because I can't. If there is a programmer here, then the programmer is chance or fate, if you like. I'm just holding a mirror up to what is already there, but it's a well, it's a scrying mirror or a circus hall of mirrors with its endless, obscuring, merging reflections.
No, that's very, very good. And I like the fact that, you've used the analogy of a mirror, which is, of course, a screen in which we see ourselves. We see ourselves as we think or believe we're presenting to the world. Whereas, of course, how we perceive ourselves in the mirror is very different from how we are perceived in the mirror of the wider populace. So there's already a sense of this tension between seeing and being seen, which, of course, is at the core of your project, because the protagonists you've chosen, the public figures, are seeing, and now, of course, they are being seen in your analysis of what they saw last. So there's an incredible tension, a creative tension, which is very rewarding, I think. In this approach that you've taken to the material, and of course the core thematic at its heart. Now, there's obviously some very interesting characters in your list of participants, some of which, if people know your other work, they would not be perhaps surprised to see you dig deeper into the lives and backstories of, and others who are very, very surprising. So this landscape develops, as you suggested, in a kind of organic way, ignoring the quality of the film selected, and to a certain degree, obviously, fascinated by the characters that you've selected in their own terms, free again of a particular cultural or kind of quality agenda. We don't want to reveal too much about what each character saw last, because that's one of the great pleasures of the book and obviously of the accompanying screening program. But as we make our way through the book, and indeed through the cinema events, are there figures whose choices and whose lives, as then revealed through the choices in your associative explorations, really surprised you? Are there characters' backstories that just you weren't expecting to find in light of this radically chance-based encounter with aspects of their history?
Do you mean in that a certain person saw a certain film in the way that these two, and in the way that these two stories kind of tangle around each other or don't?
Yeah, yes, exactly. That's a much more concise and useful way of putting it than mine just now. I think exactly that. But also then, I guess, following on from that, you've set up a wonderful kind of sort of domino effect through the lives. In certain cases, there are certain strands where a character saw a film by another character in the book. Let's talk about Kafka and Chaplin, perhaps, in that regard. Yes, so I think that did the film's choices and then the process of investigation you made on the back of what they saw reveal things about certain characters that you weren't expecting to find?
Very much so. Palmer, for instance, was killed where Tarkovsky had 6 months earlier filmed the apocalyptic flea sequence in The Sacrifice. Tarkovsky and Palmer had dealings, the director appealing to the Prime Minister for safe passage from the USSR for his son. Moreover, when I contacted Susan Austen, the director of Mozart Brothers, for film seen by Palmer, she told me that she had actually asked Palmer to star as the protagonist in Mozart Brothers. He obviously declined, but the spur-of-the-moment decision to be at that cinema on that night watching that film was evidently due to the president's intrigue in the director for the invitation she made and he refused. According to police investigations, there was no wiretap on Palmer's phone in his office or in his home, nor that of his son or his wife. So there's no way that anyone could have known in advance that he would be there that night, and no security detail was assigned to him. So there are things like that, and then there are more poetic or symbolic, heavily symbolic discoveries, like the exhibition organised by Owen Day, a culture reporter in Fort Worth, which is the liberal rival city to neighbour Dallas. And it was in Fort Worth that President Kennedy slept his final night. When the culture reporter Owen Day found out that he had been booked into the inferior hotel suite to that of Lyndon Johnson and his wife Lady Bird, insert your conspiracy, he set about gathering together art works from local collectors and museums that were hastily assembled into a one-night show exclusively for JFK and Jackie. There are diagrams and photographs so that you can see exactly where each piece was positioned in the room. John and Jackie slept in separate rooms. In fact, he slept in the one that was meant for her underneath Van Gogh's peasant shouldering a spade. But crucially, it is Picasso's Angry Owl, the sculpture that sits atop a sideboard watching over the door behind which John slept. The owl is a symbol of foreboding in Macbeth. It announces the death of the king. And an anagram of Lee Harvey Oswald, a shy owl revealed. So the president and his wife arrived there late the night before and had quite reasonably assumed the pieces they were surrounded by reproductions, if they'd paid them any attention at all. It wasn't until a handful of minutes, if that, before they left for the fateful car journey, that Jackie discovered a small catalogue detailing the information on the artworks there.
I mean, when you tell it like this, of course, I mean, you know, the sense of kind of revelation, you know, of the curtain being pulled back, Wizard of Oz style, and the mechanics of reality being shown is absolutely compelling, right? I mean, this is a very benign on one level, even though, you know, there's a death at the heart of JFK's life, and a same for Lee Harvey Oswald. At the same time, compared to the kind of idea of conspiracy theory that we associate now with the appalling, you know, present day, there's an extraordinary exhilaration about these kinds of connection, aren't there? And this is obviously the pleasure of your own investigation. You know, the journey of writing this book would have given you numerous such kind of frissons of discovery, but also for us, clearly, as readers and viewers, it's equally exciting. And in the Palmer case particularly, I mean, the exhibition in the Kennedy Suite is you know, equally remarkable. But in the Palmer case, the fact of the performance of life, you know, overlapping potentially, had he accepted the role, with the performance in film is you know, it becomes something else altogether, and it opens up a doorway into thinking about, again, as I said in my introduction, how poorly not just, you know, original cultural production has served us in recent years and decades, but also how poorly, you know, film critical responses have served us. Because, you know, while some people might say, and you know, you're on record as not being against this approach, you know, this is a kind of glorified pub quiz of fascinating facts. It's obviously way more than that, because it challenges, you know, as you said earlier, the ridiculous compartmentalization of response to cultural production, and the draining of exhilaration that your approach actually gives us, you know, we find completely lacking elsewhere. So the project unfolds. You're writing this book, and obviously I'd like to take you back to what was in a way the prompt for it, as you said, the idea of programming, because, you know, you're a curator, you're an artist, you're a collaborator, but you've curated and programmed a number of very distinctive film series and works. And so what does this idea of showing these works mean to you now? Because writing about them is one thing, of course, but showing them, what does it mean to you to show these films, and sometimes, you know, brutally cut short, depending on the life and the passing of the person watching them? What does it mean to you to think about these films going into cinemas, and how we encounter cinema now as a publicly shared space?
Well, the book and the program coexist, but they're not dependents. In both cases, here is a proposal, an invitation for an audience to see what those who see no longer last saw. And in doing so, I think it's not reclaiming, because this is specifically not a possessive art, but re-engaging with the ultimate excitement of the unknown, and all of the agency and autonomy and surrender that is involved in that, and, as you have pointed out, is actively discouraged or suppressed elsewhere. I like to go and see things that I don't know, and I suppose I won't like, and so that's a part of the project that has been rewarding for me, both in the research for the book and the presentation of the various programs. My need to focus on films and figures that, were it not for this prompt, I wouldn't be immediately interested in. I think the commercialization of collective and showing spaces, be it the cinema, the gallery, the university, spaces that must, by their nature, be defined by provocation and difference and dialogue, they've lost their sense of purpose, of self-belief. And so in some ways, this project is calling time on the authority of those institutions, which in their slow collapse become rigid and dogmatic in their short-termism, that is a drive towards the commercial, withdraw into fear and ideology. I think my point is that we do not know. We don't. And that is fine and good. We're coming constantly to know, and then it all falls apart. I think that makes sense.
It absolutely does, and I think that's really an important point because, of course, chance is one thing. The film you might see, and then you might step out and, be run over. But from the point of view of the recipient, the reader or the viewer, as you said, the totality of knowing which digital internet and wider culture proposes is that everything can be found, everything can be seen, everything can be recovered and restored and encountered, extends to one's own life, doesn't it? The idea that one can propose and curate, everything from waking onwards through breakfast and all activities. And this, of course, radically cuts through all of that, both in one's own life, but also in a culturally consuming way, because no one can know and no one can guess until the moment and the life is finished what the last film was. And there are some extremely surprising films here. And as you said, you want to refuse your own natural kind of inclinations towards certain curatorial choices. And so we find someone like Steve Jobs seeing Remember the Titans by Boaz Yakin from 2000, which is both kind of in its title sort of suggestive of kind of tech oligarchy, but at the same time, appalling.
Sorry.
Please carry on. As a piece of work.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I came back just now from Copenhagen, where I screened, where I presented a series of last movies screenings, and we showed Remember the Titans, and nobody showed up. Like, the combination of Steve Jobs and this particular Disney does not get people out. Disney actually don't even bother to distribute the film. There's no commercially available copy, so you can't screen it with permission. In fact, I think the film is strong as a portrait of interracial tensions that, because these are learned by fearful and closed-minded parents and by the old cliché of government tactics to divide citizens, these tensions, these prejudices collapse with the truth of being together in a shared space. The joke, of course, is that those who left in Copenhagen after the first part of the evening likely did so to go off and fiddle alone with their Jobs-conceived original sin consumer device made by slaves. But pairing Remember the Titans with Godard's most recent film, which he finished, or didn't, according to the title, but it feels finished to me. Godard finished it and then booked a taxi to the assisted suicide facility. I don't think this film has been screened outside of Cannes and possibly New York until this point. So if you really want a demonstration of just how much this culture with a big kicking K does not give a or takes for granted the ability to encounter, as you put it, there is... Godard recently died, and this is his final film, and it is only shown in a highly specialized environment. Now, this is a guy who said you do not have a right to show the film, but a responsibility. The generosity and liberating principle and possibilities of his work, here is the apex to file with contempt and the best of the rest of his, because in this final film, he simultaneously reveals the conjurer's trick, but in doing so, only enhances the magic.
Right. Well, look, I mean, in that kind of paralleling of Steve Jobs and Godard, you've identified the core necessity and value of the project, but also, of course, the failure of the culture into which your own project arrives. I mean, I'm both amused, as we would be, I guess, but also appalled by the fact that nobody came to the screening. in Copenhagen simply out of the crucial element of curiosity, which is again what your project is absolutely driven by, from your own point of encounter with the idea through writing it and selecting the titles, their alignments and scheduling, through to, of course, what we would hope as human beings still to be, because without curiosity, we are literally dead. Primarily because we need a curiosity about how we're going to save ourselves from ecological collapse. That seems to be also quite lacking in political culture. At the same time, someone whose life is dedicated to images, who's actually made the most significant body of work, surely in cinema, about the nature and quality and possibility of the moving image, himself ignored at the end. I mean, you can't find, more telling alignments and associations than this. So, of course, the project already has validated itself, even though it's only weeks and, or several months into its life in the world. And that's really a staggering thing, I think. But I'd like to, move on now a little bit more to what this project means and also how it's been received by its very valuable endorsers. And, you have in the book, a wonderful setup piece by Erica Bolson, of course, who writes on moving image widely. You've got an intermission by the great provocateur Bill Drummond, and I'm not going to spoil that in any way at all, because people need to buy this book and enjoy it in all its rich and myriad ways. And you've got a kind of game-changing afterword by the French writer and curator Nicole Brennes, which, again, we won't spoil at all. But when the book went out, into the world for obviously first responses, you had an incredible and uniformly kind of amazed and applauding response from some of the biggest names in thinking about contemporary culture and cinema. Laura Mulvey, of course, who's identified film as being death 24 times a second as much as it is life, is, of course, a key protagonist in this kind of response. And she calls it very strange and deeply thought-provoking, and she leaves it at that, rightly, as she should do, because it's the audience's job to take that forward. But I wonder if we could just tease forward what Ian Sinclair says a little bit more, because he calls it the end game of end games, a commendably perverse demonstration of how it's possible for something to be assimilated by way of rumour and manipulated history without being experienced. And that, as one would expect from Ian Sinclair, is a great provocation, assimilation without experience. And so I wonder if you could tease out a little bit more for us how the films have been received. You mentioned the Copenhagen screening, but are people engaging with this, experiencing it in the way that Ian Sinclair would propose and that you, of course, would hope? And perhaps let's start, if we could, with the Durational Porto screening.
Just to say very briefly, before we get to Porto, to return to Copenhagen, before the disregarded Godard screening, the ghouls were out in force to witness the programme composed of endings. That is one possible formulation of the last movie's programme presentation. It's about feature film length, but it is composed of film fragments, all cut by death. So Boris Vian was at the premiere of I Spit on Your Graves, a film adapted from his novel Without Consent, when he stood up and shouted at the producers and fell down dead. Another heart that stopped during a film was Sergio Leone's, who was at home with his wife watching Robert Wise's I Want to Live, a joke that wouldn't be lost on even the most Italian of Italian film directors. It was on television. It was playing on television when he died. When there are witnesses, we can be very specific about when we cut the film, and this is one way of presenting the movies and they're dead. In Porto, however, was the antithesis of the Godard problem. As a kind of dry run for the presentations at Light Industry in New York and the ICA in London, we had a durational event at the Battaglia. Ultimately, the ideal presentation of last movies is durational, because a day and a night is the measure of lived human experience, right? It's also a span of time that allows us to reach almost from the inception of the form, with Kafka watching Chaplin's The Kid, to the present day with Godard watching his own. In that you have a representative film and character from each step along the way in cinema's development, if you like, for want of a better word. And so you follow, you travel this giant curve of film history without interference, without perspective. You know, that's what makes the book something elsewhere. It was 17 or 18 hours in Porto without any significant breaks, and 101 people stayed. The doors were locked, none of them left. You couldn't return after a certain time into the auditorium. And what really struck me about this was actually during the brief breaks, I would look around at mostly people in their late teens and early 20s, and some of them were on their own and others were in groups. The loners stared off into the distance. The groups stood or sat and spoke. None of them were tethered to their screens, not one. They were not using that break to get plugged back in. They were using the whole experience as, I would hope, in what might seem paradoxical as both suspension and reconnection.
Just briefly, I mean, tremendous, to see those kind of juxtapositions, and just a comment really on the idea of duration, because of course 24 hours is the idea of the Aristotelian unity. Something takes place, in a time and a place over that absolutely primary measure of experience and existence, and so I think you're absolutely right to feel that is the kind of maybe the sort of aspiring measure for an encounter with these films when they're shown, but also just to kind of echo what you said about the responses you encountered, how powerful it is and how energizing it obviously has been to audiences to come back in, even if they are kind of ghoulish on one level in Copenhagen, and obviously nothing to do with it with being in Denmark, it could be anywhere, but the idea that there is a reason to gather, because the way and the offer that is being made, for the purpose of this gathering, is so distinctive and fresh, and yet at the same time speaks to something much, much larger and deeper than just what film somebody famous saw before they died. It's about the very nature of life and its purpose and what kind of meaning we ascribe to or find within it. But I'll come back to that a bit later. So sorry, please carry on if there was anything you wanted to add to that report.
Well, I would say, responding to what you just said, to consider this a project about death is really missing the point. It is, as you can tell, a celebration of life via the medium that imitates it. And when we're talking about the gathering, I'm thinking about Badiou, the being and the event, the philosophical event, that there is still an inherent power. The inherent power is in coming together. You cannot have it otherwise. You have to go. There's no such thing as an online event, because it is in the accident and chance of going that the invisible is revealed. The previously unimaginable becomes real. And so, building on my previous projects or gestures and proposals, what Last Movies means to do is have the audience think about their journey to and from as part of the whole package. Yeah.
No, very much so. And of course, the ripple effects of this project, and audience encounters with whichever iteration of the screenings that you're doing, is based exactly on that thrill that we've all had at different points when we encounter cinema and its possibilities. The anticipation towards the event, of course, the unfolding, and then the kind of conversation and influence it has after. But because, of course, saturation is total now and can be accessed from one's own pocket. That idea of the public space is even more necessary to underscore. It's interesting that your book and program, are running into the world alongside, the UK release of the film, the documentary about the Scala cinema, which is all about that kind of, collision of arts works, so-called high and low meeting together in the shared space, one that was a refuge by all accounts to many people who could not find, a certain kind of cultural or spatial harbour elsewhere. So it seems very much a project that would have been shown, or would certainly honour the work of the Scala if the Scala as a cinema was still functioning. But let's go back to some of these respondents in the early encounter with the book before publication, because I'm very struck, by all of them, and they rightly honour the project and celebrate it enormously. But particularly drawn to what Sukhdev Sandhu said about, again, this relationship between the larger public figure and our own life. He ends his piece for Prospect magazine by saying, "I myself can't help wondering, what if we were to watch every movie as if it were our last?" And I wonder if you could think a little bit for us about whether it's the movie quality. I mean, you've spoken very well about the fact that the movie kind of offers us a simulacrum of life, and the project is much more one about existence rather than mortality. But do you think there's something absolutely singular in the fact of cinema here? Could you imagine working on a project where it was the last book read, the last music listened to, the last artwork seen? Would that have the same charge for you? And do you think it might land into the culture in the same way?
There's something about the duration and the meditation of film, in the extent to which we are bombarded today, all of our senses, all of the time. The cinema, for me, has become a place of thinking, a refuge for the senses, one of the few places that I know I can go to where subconsciously the work gets done. In fact, never mind what's up there on screen. Loose ends are tied up and new things emerge. So my particular relationship with the cinema, I think, has changed and mutated in this uncontrolled response to the dogma and all-pervasive image saturation governing us by distraction. Sukhdev asking that question represents the idea of the going and the seeing as something meditative or ritualistic, a kind of prayer, and the way that the communion of the photograph and the sound in this moving image thing washes over us, involves us and holds us completely in that space. It doesn't work for the short song or the long book. It's the totality of the form, drawing all of these different expressions together in that space. I think that we live in ultra-religious times, but believe in nothing. And watching the Scala film, I thought, of course, things were hard then as well. It was precarious then as well. It was miserable then as well. And yet there was this common project. There was a can-do it attitude. There was a space in the margin that was open to all, a refuge, as you say. And I wonder what it is that has collapsed that margin. I can't quite get a handle on that. Or is this a particularly Western kind of middle class complaint? I don't think it is, but
I mean, there might be a class factor to it. Of course, the ability and the time to indulge such thoughts and even such activities, in the West or the global North. But at the same time, I think there's been a whole range of documentaries over the last few years where, cinema cultures from the global South have been celebrated and explored. The loss of a cinema in Central Africa, Indian cinemas and projection houses, the celebration of the importance of cinema, in all sorts of cultures, who might have much younger or more occasional production histories, but as audiences, it's just as important. I mean, cinema, you're right. I mean, it was a great response to my question about other art forms having the same impact. There is something extraordinary about that, both that public-private quality of being in a cinema. You're both in your own head, and the viewing might take you wherever it takes you, and yet you're sitting a few seats or whatever from somebody else. So I think you've really caught that. So I mean, for you as you're an artist, you're a maker, and you're also obviously making in your programming and curation and your enabling of others as well. Has this project, I mean, it's already obviously only been several months in the world, but has it kind of changed how you might approach other projects, the response you've had, or the nature of thinking about this public-private space, and also the nature of duration, perhaps? Has it already started to sort of impact on your thinking about how you might take things forward in the future?
Watching Godard's film, which is 20 minutes long, I thought, perfect. Everything should be either 20 minutes or 20 hours. Until now, we had the whole duration thing wrong. And I think that it is essential for an alternative kind of organizing principle like this one to be more widely employed, especially by institutions that require a physical response. I know that this is a very specific proposal, and so I don't know what that would be, but as it stands, the organization and presentation of work through themes and signifiers that tend to feel quite desperate and increasingly crude and reductive, the audience turns away, right? And they turn away to TikTok, which I think is as appropriately named as Apple bearing the logo of original sin in the bitten apple is appropriate as their symbol. So I'll continue to stay away from social media and attempt to excite the new Luddite revolution in all that I do, going forwards or backwards or sideways. I don't know.
No, I think I mean, it's obviously slightly unfair of me to suggest that you've already taken on the implications of this and are already rolling out another project, because that again just plays to the kind of consumption and kind of Puritan productivity of a certain kind of work ethic, which your own practice challenges. You're both, of course, extremely rigorous in what you do, but at the same time, the last thing is about just producing another artifact for commodification. So I think that was a slightly misdirected question. But obviously, as we move sort of towards a close at this point, I'm just thinking now about the implications for the figures themselves of these last encounters, as much as we can know them, which of course is very little in most cases. But the groupings, just to entice people into the book and the screening program a little bit more, because I just want to stress how richly rewarding and also hugely entertaining this book is, and just opens up possibilities for thinking about all sorts of lives and ways of engaging with culture beyond even the expansive palette of the book's references. But there's a number of kind of groupings one can find in this, which are to do with obviously the work of the person who died. They're looking at the latest edit or what such like, and there's a handful of those. There's work that is watched by a friend of the maker, and that being ironically the last thing they see. There's work as you say, in relation to a body of work like Boris Vian's, which is not a good expression of it, and so on. And then there are really just fascinating sort of almost throwaway viewings that we all have. We might have a Saturday night TV viewing or a Sunday matinee BBC Two screening or such like. And then there are very particular and very powerful and very clearly very chosen titles, regardless of the fact that they knew, of course, which they could not, that they might be dying shortly after, that really speak to the person in question. I think one I would just draw attention to in this case is Phil Oakes' Seeing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which, given his own tragic history of mental health difficulties, is really a powerful one.
Yeah.
But now looking at this project as a whole, it is, of course, by definition, not complete. As you said at the very beginning, there are infinite numbers of other characters who could come into it. But I think I'm right in saying, am I, that you want to kind of document audience and reader responses to this, and obviously any kind of examples they'd like to propose, while also perhaps updating where you have extra information, as you mentioned, certain of the entries themselves. How can listeners come across those updates?
I'm not sure that the entire list of characters and films has been published online, but in the book there is a prompt for people to contact the publisher, Tenement Press, in the event that they know any who have been missed. And we have had a couple of contributions so far that I've yet to look into properly, but are likely to form an expanded version of the book in the future. One of these is Joseph Breen, the head of the Hays Code, watching The Sound of Music, the Robert Wise film, which I'd not actually seen until I found this out, and was very impressed. I digress, but only slightly, in that this discovery of Breen and The Sound of Music connects neatly to John Dillinger. Of course, it is Dillinger's face on the cover of the book, or rather, it is the mould of his face in the death mask that was taken by the FBI after his murder, without consent, obviously. This death mask apparently hung at the entrance of Hoover's offices for the duration of his career. That's J. Edgar Hoover, the founder of the FBI as we know it today, who used Dillinger and cinema in order to attain the kind of force that he wanted for his fledgling bureau. The Hays Code was brought in only weeks after Dillinger was murdered, the Hays Code restricting what could and couldn't be shown on screen, and this is not a coincidence. The use on the book's cover of the photograph at the FBI of the death mask they took is intended as a reclamation of the mask of the face.
Very powerful, and I have to say the Dillinger chapter, I mean, is one of the most compelling among many, and really does draw, as you just said, many of these strands between life, art, and the kind of structures within which we're forced or sometimes choose to live, into really sharp and kind of rewarding relief. So for you listeners out there who are thinking, should I get this book? Yes, the answer, of course, very clearly is yes, you must get this book. If you're engaged with cinema and if you're engaged with culture, and if in fact you're actually currently alive, then I would say that this book is actually an indispensable manual to staying alive in the richest possible way that you would hope to imagine, because we only go round once. We only are in the cinema of life that one time, and if you want to maximize your encounter with cinema while you are alive, and also with the life that continues during the screening and before and after it, hopefully well after it, for all of you, then I would urge you to get this book. And I would urge you to obviously find your way to the screenings. The ICA is running a season of screenings on a monthly basis. You'll find that ICA pages and all the ways you know how. Please stay in touch with Tenement Press, of course, one of the great new publishers of our time, with their very distinctive yellow jackets, standing out in every way from the crowd around them. Please follow Stanley Schtinter's expansive portfolio of work across all art forms and social and other spaces by going to his own website, Schtinternet, but also to purge.xxx, where you'll find a lot more of his other work available to you. This has been a real pleasure talking to you, Stanley. And we've taken a particular line in this conversation, I think, which is important to flag up to listeners. We talked about the kind of the structures of thought, the implication, the meaning of the word, more than perhaps in another conversation we would have talked, in a much more sort of gossipy way about some of the incredible facts and alignments that you've hinted at, very, very brilliantly in your answers. That is a conversation for another time, and it's a great one to have, and you will have this, dear listener, of course, with your fellow readers and viewers in the way that was described in Porto, of course, and in your own circulation and social network. So please do take up this great offer that Stanley has put before us to read and see around and through those films that those who no longer can see last saw. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Stanley. My name's Gareth Evans. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you, and goodbye.